my great pleasure to meet you today and share my research with you. Um, I was checking my PowerPoint and hopefully it works smoothly. There are a little bit glitch that I find right before um, our meeting. So fingers crossed that everything works smoothly. Without further ado, I will share my research, which I prepared with a PowerPoint and some audio recording. And then at the end of my lecture, then I'll take a Q&A. The Tsurushi district of Osaka is known for being the largest and oldest Koreatown in Japan, with a concentration of about 150 shops owned by Zainichi, or Korean residents in Japan. The business owners and shop assistants are a mix of old-comers whose families migrated from Korea to Japan as a colonial subjects, and newcomers who came as a part of a relatively recent transmigration movement from South Korea. On 28 November 2015, I visited the Zainichi Koreatown for the first time. The main street of Zainichi was filled with the loud sound of Korean drumming, accompanied by a piercing melody played on the senap, a conically shaped Korean wind instrument. The senap player was Ha Yongsu, a Tokyo-based Chinese musician affiliated with Kumgangsan Gagukdan, Kumgangsan Opera Theater, a Japan-based North Korean performing art troupe. From the gate of Koreatown, about 12 musicians marched down its main road, visiting shops and blessing the wealth of businesses. When the parade ended, I was supposed to meet Ha Yongsu. In today's talk, I When the parade ended, I was supposed to meet Ha Yongsu, another Chinese musician, Youngchi, a renowned performer and teacher of Korean national music based in South Korea, introduced me to Ha Yongsu. Ha Yongsu was visiting Osaka to join a purification ritual organized by his friend Kim Kukchon, who has also actively played and taught Korean drumming, as well as running an Osaka-based Korean percussion troupe, Hakdari Nongakdan. While waiting for Ha Yongsu to finish his performance, I overheard a conversation between an elderly man and a shop owner. The senior stated in Korean, 예전 쭈루아시엔 빨갱이가 많았지 지금 그렇지 않아. In the past, 쭈루아시 was crowded with leftists, but now it is different. Judging by his fluency in Korean, with a minimal accent, I gathered that he must have been a first-generation Korean migrant who had moved from South Korea to Japan recently, or after the late 1980s, when South Korean government eased its restrictions on overseas travel and migration for its nationals. He seemed to believe that Turash was no longer crowded with 빨갱이 or leftist, which in the minds of many elderly South Koreans often refers to North Korean supporters or communists, whom they consider the other. His observation may have some basis, as over the last 2 decades in Tsuruashi, elements of Hallyu, or the Korean wave of South Korean popular culture, have been the town's main attractions for both international and domestic visitors. Whereas the Zainichi siding with North Korea have been intimidated with demarcating their North Korean identity, since it often aggravates and triggers anti-Korean sentiment and hate speech. However, unlike the elderly man's wishful simplification of Tsuruashi's ethnic landscape, when it comes to nation-state affiliations and the ideological predilections of the Zainichi population in Tsuruashi, and more broadly Osaka in Japan, one can never know or should not assume who is with the North or the South or claims some other affiliation, unless Zainichi individuals or their families outspeak their national identity or their ideological leanings. This vignette highlights the ethnic complexity, dynamics, and overlapping Korean national identities present in Japan, where different groups of Koreans intersect and are grounded in contrasting matrices of historical, contemporary, colonial, post-colonial, national, and nation-state relationships with Korea as well as with Japan. In today's talk, I focus on the musical lives of some third-generation Zainichi artists and demonstrate how these Korean drummers and their lives reflect the inherent complexity of the ethnic Korean community, whose lives in post-colonial Japan were shaped along in the context of the partitioning of the Korean peninsula and Japan's relationship with each of the two Koreas. By examining Zainichi Korean engagement in and advocacy of Korean drumming, I hope this research contributes to understanding of the Korean ethnicity, diasporic identity and agency, and the role and significance of ethnic culture in the context of migration. Over the 35 years of Japanese colonization of Korea, about 2 million Koreans were displaced to Japan as industrial laborers and military servicemen, in addition to a small number of Korean students and business-related migrants. From the slide, you can see the sizes of Korean numbers increased in Japan during the colonial period. At the time of Japanese annexation of Korea in 1910, only several thousand Koreans were living in Japan. Shortly after the start of Japanese colonial rule, a major wave of Korean migration to Japan began, sparked by a labor shortage in Japan in the 1920s. Most of the migrant workers were originally farmers from Korea's southern regions, such as the provinces of Gyeongsang and Jeolla, as well as Jeju Island. In Japan, they engaged in manual and manual work in the construction and mining industries at lower wages than ethnic Japanese. These migrants largely come voluntarily until the outbreak of World War II in the late 1930s, which led to the drafting of between 700K to 800K Koreans, both men and women, to work in the factories and mines in Japan. Until 1945, all Koreans, whether in Korea or Japan, were subjects of the Japanese Empire. With the end of war and of Japanese colonial rule over Korea, all Korean residents in Japan were registered as 조선새끼, 조선족 in Korean, through which they were reclassified as foreign nationals. In the meanwhile, in Japan, many Korean migrants found communist ideology appealing, largely due to their background and dissatisfaction with the working conditions, low-wage exploitation, and the unequal treatment they faced as a colonial subject. For this and other practical reasons, upon the political partitioning of Korea, Although about 97 percentile of Koreans in Japan originally came from the peninsula's southern regions, nearly all sympathized with the North Korean side. Subsequently, the Korean migrant community in Japan split into two camps, associated with one or the other of the regimes on the Korean peninsula, with 총련, 제일조선인 총연합회, the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, siding with North Korea, and 민단, 제일대한민국 민단, Korean Resident Union in Japan, siding with South Korea. Besides the attraction of communism for those with little economic and social privilege, a primary concern of Zainichi was maintaining their Korean heritage and sustaining themselves as a social minority in Japan. To them, an association with the North was seen as an effective means of achieving these, since North Korea's economy was better than the South's at the time. From the mid-1950s, 청년 received robust financial and cultural support from the North. Much of the 청년's budget went to establishing and supporting Zainichi Korean businesses and financial institutions, and running hundreds of Korean schools around Japan. In these schools, the North Korean school curriculum was adapted for Zainichi Korean children's education and taught in Korean. In this way, North Korean performing arts, including music and dance, became the prominent Korean performance practices in Japan. In contrast, when the South Korean government established official diplomatic relations with Japan in 1965, the Zainichi Koreans who had opposed 총련 and associated themselves with 민단 acquired South Korean nationality and were thus granted permanent residence status in Japan. If North Korea and 총련 offered practical benefits and cultural resources during the formative stage of the post-colonial Zainichi Korean community in Japan, the downside of those who took the North Korean side was that they were identified as stateless Koreans, since Japan did not recognize North Korea as an independent state. However, gaining South Korean nationality enabled 민단 Zainichi to freely travel across Japan and South Korea and retrieve or newly build their relationship with the country their ancestors or they had left. To the ethnic bifurcation in post-war Japan, South Koreans who moved to Japan since 1965 and more visibly after the 1980s have added a new dimension to the ethnic dynamics among Koreans in Japan. These Koreans identify themselves with 한인회 or 한인회 rather than 청년 or 민단. If the pre-1945 Chinese migration conforms to the characteristics of a diaspora as a forced migration whose dispersal was caused by and shaped along with colonial force, the post-1965 Korean migration to Japan has been the case of a voluntary migration. In either case, some migrants have been fully assimilated into Japanese society with a little marker of Korean heritage or cultural identity, yet many others resist or disinterest assimilation while claiming ties to a lost nation, that is Joseon, that exists in a different time and place, or contemporary North or South Korea. On this slide, please pay attention to the two quotes I extracted from two different scholars, James Clifford and Levitt and Schiller. James Clifford emphasized that contemporary diasporic practices cannot be reduced to a phenomenon of the nation state. So he basically emphasized look at contemporary diasporic practice beyond the nation state frame. Similarly, Levitt and Schiller emphasized that today's contemporary migration, which in their term transmigration, cannot be understood just based on one single nation state associations or two different nation-state associations, but there are much more complexity that you can read from the migration processes and migration types that we observe today. The complexity that I observe with the Zainichi Koreans, not all Zainichi Koreans conform to a single migrant profile. So in addition to the complexity of nation-state relationships, not all Zainichi Koreans conform to a single migrant profile. Some, over time, as a third and even fourth generation Korean migrants, some of them have basically fully assimilated into Japanese society. Many others have always maintained strong ties with Korea, even the nation lost to the colonialism and post-colonial fractioning into the north and the south. Yet majority Zainichi find Japan as the preferred place for residency, even if they have confronted internal racism and been granted with hierarchical citizenship. Thus, whether their migration dates back to the first or second half of the 20th century, Zainichi communities comprise some features of old diaspora, cases of loss and longing, and also characteristics of today's transmigration. Speaking about transmigration or transnational migration approach, the transnationalist approach is distinguished from that of classical migration studies, which focuses on the social integration and assimilation of the migrants within the nation-state frame. Instead, studies of transnational migration explore the local and the global intersections and the types of interconnectedness that migrants enact transcending nation-state boundaries. If the discourses of globalization were formed in consideration of economic and industrial power flowing from the center to the periphery, the transnationalist approach values the dynamics of migration processes without undermining various agencies played out by migrants. Ursula Piset and Irini Ciotti have argued for the effectiveness of a biographical analysis, especially in delineating the trajectories and dynamics of migrating and migrated individuals whose experiences greatly vary. So when we think about the individual experience of migration, there is almost no uniformity existing. Taking the aforementioned studies into consideration, now I focus on the biographies of musicians to articulate the complexity inherent in Korean communities in Japan. Korean drumming, known as 풍물, 농악, or 사물놀이, is a prominent traditional Korean musical genre popular in Korea and abroad, and adopted by many overseas Koreans as a tool for heritage education, identity expression, or community building. The contemporary practices of Korean drumming in Japan may have been a post-colonial emergence, rather directly related with its implementation as a part of the social activist movement in the 1970s Japan, and the influence of 사물놀이, invented as a neo-traditional cultural form in South Korea in 1978. According to Rika Lee, a Zainichi scholar in sociology, all Korean performing arts activities in Japan have been deeply related with social movements led by and engaging Zainichi. It is not far-fetched to view the cultivation of Korean music and dance, whether led by the 청년, 민단, or 한인회 individuals or institutions, is in fact the manifesto of Zainichi activism and voicing out for their community in Japan by way of culture. Especially in the 1980s, young Korean and Zainichi Korean student activists formed cultural clubs in their universities and adopted 풍물 and 탈춤, a mask dance drama, as iconic cultural activities to foster and increase ethnic pride among young Zainichi Koreans. In the meanwhile, the South Korean band 사물놀이, the group that introduced the indoor version of Korean drumming, frequently toured Japan from the early 1980s, appealing to both Korean and Japanese audiences with their sound. Strikingly, by 2008, there were approximately 1,000 Korean drumming groups existing across Japan. Between 2015 and 2019, I met several Zainichi drummers and conducted interviews in Japan as well as in South Korea. The drummers who I met multiple times are Ha Yongsu, Youngchi, and Kukchon, the three musicians who I introduced at the very beginning of today's presentation. Among many Zainichi drummers, I choose to focus on these three for contrasting due to their contrasting biographical profiles, their styles of music, and career aspirations and trajectories, and their relationships to Korea and Japan as a diasporic individuals and artists. All three musicians acknowledged having been inspired or influenced by the original 사물놀이 band initiated in South Korea, going beyond the range of nationalities that they hold. Ha Yongsu has worked as a full-time musician with 금강산 가극단, the 금강산 Opera Theater, since 1992. 금강산 Opera Theater, based in Tokyo, is the largest Korean performance troupe in Japan. Recognizing its affiliation with North Korea, it focuses the Korean music styles developed in North Korea as a part of its national performance culture. The troupe was established in 1955 under the name 제1조선인 중앙예술단, Central Art Troupe of Koreans in Japan. At first, its membership consisted of only 18 members, all trained in Western classical music. In the 1960s, the troupe gradually incorporated Korean instruments imported from North Korea. In 1974, when the troupe visited Pyongyang for the first time, the then chairman Kim Il-sung appreciated their performance, bestowed the troupe with the name 금강산 가극단. The 금강산's main repertoire has focused on smaller-scale solo and ensemble works from North Korea or composed by Zainichi Koreans. Today, it has about 70 members, consisting of third and fourth generation Zainichi Koreans, including performers, instructors, choreographers, composers, arrangers, and administrative staff, and they tour Japan every year from Hokkaido to Okinawa, according to its primary mission of enabling Korean cultures to be widely accessible in Japan for both Korean and Japanese audiences. Like many other musicians there, Ha Yongsu learned music as a student at a North Korean school. However, his exposure to Korean music and relationship with the North Korea stemmed from his family background. Originally from Gyeongsang Province, Ha Yongsu's grandfather moved to Japan in the late stage of the colonial period and then chose to be sided with North. His father, Ha Junong, was an early 금강산 가극단 member and specialized in 거문고, six-string zither of Korea, as a second-generation Zainichi musician in the 1960s. Influenced by his father, Ha Yongsu grew up playing 거문고, six-string zither, while additionally learning Korean drumming and wind instrument. Today, he plays a range of Korean instruments, from a string to wind and percussion instruments, in various performance contexts, as a part of and outside his assignments with the 금강산 Opera Theater. Next slide, I will show Kumgangsan Theater's performance scenes. Although to lay Japanese audiences, whether this troupe represents South Korea, North Korea is not so clear, but clearly Kumgangsan Gagukdan is affiliated with Chongnyeon and North Korea, and the members of Kumgangsan Gagukdan referred North Korea as their Jogok or motherland.
ユンドヒョンバンドと共演するキャン。北朝鮮を祖国とする在日朝鮮人が作ったクムガンサン歌劇団の若手グループ。
北、南、そして日本との関係、すべてにおいて、特に次の世代にはもうちょっと平和で仲のいい、そういうために音楽でね、何かできればと僕も思ってます。
東京朝鮮文化会館で韓国のロックバンドが公演を行うのは初めてのこと。会場には在日朝鮮人の学生を中心に2000人余りが詰めかけた。
여러분 반갑습니다. 저희들은 이남에서 온
When I sat down with Ha Yongsu one afternoon, he stated that his life as a Korean musician in Japan has a two sides. As a program director and chief percussionist with the Gagukdan, he performs music that is institutionally mandated in style and content. However, when it comes to his own predilections, he performs what makes his heart sing and provides him with a sense of fulfillment. He frequently joins Korean drumming parade held in Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities in Japan as a performer, and he values such opportunities where Zainichi Korean musicians can get together, free of their affiliations with the Chongnyeon or Mindan. Even if he has been engaged with the North Korean national music scenes for 2/3 of his life as a Gagukdan member and Chongnyeon member, as a diasporic individual, he highlights that he values the opportunities to collaborate with broader groups of musicians who are Japanese, Zainichi, South Korean, or more. By doing so, he wants to show those junior Zainichi musicians a possible career path that they could take as a diasporic musicians who specialize in Korean music in Japan. Youngchi was born in Osaka and, like Ha Yongsu, is a third-generation Zainichi. His family is, however, connected with Mindan. Running a Korean barbecue restaurant, Korean yakiniku restaurant, Youngchi's father supports the Korean culture scenes in Japan, particularly in Osaka area. He hosts visiting South Korean musicians and cultivating friendships with them. Influenced by his father's love for Korean music, Youngchi and all his siblings grew up learning Korean traditional instruments or dance at the private studios run by Korean teachers in Osaka area, while attending Japanese schools. Youngchi began learning jango, hourglass-shaped Korean drum, at the age of 10, and was soon recognized as a jango prodigy in Osaka area. After graduating from middle school, he moved to South Korea to major Korean music, specializing in percussion and wind instrument called daegum, bamboo transverse flute. He and his siblings studied at the National Korean Music High School in South Korea, and later completed their BA in music at Seoul National University. Even as a university student, Youngchi established his reputation as a professional musician in the field of traditional Korean music. With his talent, he won prizes at prestigious music competitions held in South Korea, such as the World Samuluri Festival Contest and the Donga Music Contest. Nevertheless, Youngchi's interest in Korean music was never confined to traditional approaches, but extended to the creation of crossover genres, which then was new and very experimental. Inspired by a thriving market for world music scenes in the early 1990s, young and progressive musicians strove to update the traditional sound of Korean music by fusing them with non-Korean musical elements. When I met Youngchi in Osaka and Tokyo in 2015, he had been promoting his new group called Sunhee. In that, he collaborates with Ha Kim, a well-established jazz pianist in Japan, and Zainichi himself. Sunhee features a crossover sound that it produces together with the Trisonic, a Tokyo-based Japanese jazz band. Ha Kim is a member of Trisonic. Branding the group as a juncture of a Korean traditional and Western jazz sound, he won a contract with a Japanese music agency and has been touring Japan annually since 2015, drawing full houses with his concerts in major Japanese cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka, and Seoul in South Korea. Next slide, I will play some music that Youngchi, Ha Kim, and also South Korean pansori singer. Pansori is one-person narrative drama, which is iconic traditional music in South Korea. So South Korean pansori singer Lee Bong-geun joined Youngchi and Ha Kim. Both Youngchi and Ha are Zainichi. And what I want to point out is by embedding himself in both Korean and Japanese music scenes and carrying on his cosmopolitan drive to promote Korean drumming, Youngchi has made himself a national and transnational celebrity in Japan, Korea, and beyond. Kukchon, another third-generation Zainichi Korean drummer, has been leading a Korean percussion band in Osaka for over 10 years. Kukchon was born to a Zainichi family, all of whose members were naturalized as Japanese. None of his family spoke Korean or fosters Korean cultural practices at home. Until his 20s, Kukchon knew and thought little about his Korean heritage or identity. By chance, he met some senior Zainichi drummers in Tokyo and Osaka. Inspired, he learned Jango and has performed it in and around Osaka for more than 25 years. In the late 2000s, he started his own percussion band, Hakdari Nongakdan, composed of both old-comer and newcomer Koreans with a full-time day job. Kim's group mostly performs at Korean community events organized by Zainichi Koreans, who are affiliated with either North or South Korea or who have no nation-state affiliation. If Ha Yongsu and Youngchi are identified with North or South Korea in terms of their nationalities, the musical field in which they grounded, Kukchon states that he, as a naturalized Zainichi, feels a greater flexibility and freedom in transcending the nation-state borders that characterize Korean communities in Japan. His sense of freedom seems to be also stem from his pursuit of Korean drumming as a serious leisure activity rather than a profession. For him, gathering with the Hakdari Nongakdan members who share a similar interest in Korean drumming or Korean culture is just as meaningful as accruing fame as a performer or honing his drumming skills. Next slide, I'm gonna show Hakdari Nongakdan's weekly practice, particularly this meeting with his members to practice drum is very significant and valuable for Kim Kukchon's life, according to Kim Kukchon. Raised in a family environment whose Korean identity was repressed rather than celebrated, Kim Kukchon expresses that he had yearned for Korean culture while growing up, reflecting the joy he had with Korean culture integrated into his life. He wishes to see Korean drumming as a living culture firmly rooted in the everyday sonic landscape of Zainichi life and perceived as a fun activities. Kim Kukchon expressed that he really hoped that Korean culture and his drumming felt natural and became second nature to Zainichi life in Japan. And he also shared some of the questions he carried all the time as someone who was raised and naturalized Zainichi, who was naturalized as a Japanese, that why he's doing this music and what is the value to his mind. So the following quote kind of encapsulates what he always asks himself and also wonders as he lives as a Korean drummer and Zainichi in Japan. He states, quote, I constantly ask myself whether or not my drumming is my own culture or just mimicking the Koreanness that was the norm in Korea, our ancestral home. I am Zainichi, born and raised in Japan, and so something that native Koreans might feel as a natural might not be the same as how we feel and what we are. So I constantly wonder and question whether I am playing my music or someone else's, end quote. Over the musicians' three different musical trajectories, each of these third-generation Korean musicians in Japan has encountered the politics of North versus South Korea, or between both Koreas and Japan, yet has simultaneously transcended nation-state boundaries by exploring what nation means for diasporic Koreans in Japan. Ha Yongsu acknowledges his association with North Korea, yet does not confine his music to within the boundaries of North Korean national music, participating in pan-Zainichi Korean events and collaborating with the Japanese and South Korean musicians. In doing so, he intends to alert young generation Zainichi cultural agency and make them think how they could live diasporic and professional musicians in Japan. Youngchi seems also concretely connected to a nation state, that is South Korea, in his education, family relationship, and residency status. His challenge of moving beyond a traditional South Korean musical approach was evident in his professional journey as a fusion and crossover musician, in which he took Korean music beyond its racial and ethnic confinements. One might relate Youngchi's cosmopolitan drive and crossover ambitions to a kind of a neo-colonialism that has influenced the traditional music scenes in East Asia broadly. However, the musician never pushed back or de-emphasized his drumming as a part of Korean heritage when performing it on domestic or international stages. Rather, the musician's intention was to make the sound of Korea broadly and widely accessible beyond its geocultural boundary, so that Korean drumming contributes to the opening of a hegemonic music market that has spared little room for the musicians and the sound from cultural margins. Unlike Ha Yongsu and Youngchi, Kim Kukchon's border crossing is both personal and communal. On one hand, he wants to challenge notions of ethnic Koreanness, rolled up in his drumming rooting Korea by way of his diasporic identity. On the other hand, he essentializes Zainichi Korean identity through his drumming, which to him is a vital manifestation of the Korean lives of his grandparents and those of other Zainichi Koreans, both when they migrated to Japan and in their lives there. Whether implicitly or explicitly, and through a range of different means, for all three musicians, their drumming represents a meaningful act on the part of a Zainichi individual who sees the need to challenge and redraw the national, racial, cultural, and political borders they have faced as a Zainichi with a foot in both Korea and Japan and beyond. As Koreans, there is a risk that in expressing their ethnic identity or cultural authority in Japan, discrimination against them will be aggravated. However, doing so also grants a historically marginalized group an opportunity to socially mobilize by means of their practice and demarcate a community of belonging as they accommodate and assure their heritage as Zainichi Koreans. The diverse range of stories that the Zainichi Korean artists present as they engage with Korean performing arts point to the spectrum of agencies enacted by those diasporic individuals as they consciously shape their connection to their ancestral homeland and facilitate their lives in Japan to construct themselves as contemporary transnational musicians in individually distinctive ways. Thank you.